in the blistering heat of the Arizona Territory, where life was cheap and honor was everything, a woman's future was a thing to be bartered, not chosen. Josephine Bellwether, daughter of the most powerful man in the territory, was promised to a cruel sheriff, her life set in stone like the sun-baked mesas. But destiny is a wild current, and it arrived for her in the form of an Apache warrior named Cale. It wasn't a word or a promise that changed her world forever. It was a single touch, a moment of impossible connection that steadied her falling body and shattered her gilded cage. That touch ignited a love that defied two worlds, and in doing so, awakened a war that would paint the canyons red with the blood of both their peoples. This is the story of their flight, a desperate race against a past that will not let them go. The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the souls of its inhabitants as surely as it did the boardwalks. For Josephine Bellwether, it was the dust of her cage. At 20, she possessed a spirit as untamed as the surrounding territory, a fact her father, Jedediah Bellwether, tirelessly sought to remedy. Jedediah owned the vast B-Bar-B ranch, the town's mercantile, and held the mortgage on half the souls in the valley. He was a king in all but name, and Josephine was his crown jewel, a symbol of the civilization he'd brutally carved out of the wilderness. Her life was a meticulously crafted facade of propriety. Mornings were for managing the household accounts, afternoons for practicing the piano tunes her mother had brought from St. Louis, and evenings were for enduring the suffocating presence of her intended Sheriff Silas Kane. Kane was a man forged from the same hard earth as her father. His face was a roadmap of harsh sun, and harder living, his eyes the color of a washed-out sky, holding no warmth. He had a reputation for justice, but his justice was swift, merciless, and often indistinguishable from vengeance. Years ago, an Apache raid had claimed his first wife and child, and the event had hollowed him out, leaving behind only a cold, burning hatred for the people he called savages. Jedediah saw Kane's iron will as the perfect instrument to protect his empire, and by extension, his daughter. To Josephine, his hand on her arm felt like a manacle. "You seem distracted tonight, Josie." Kane's voice rasped, cutting through the melody she was fumbling on the piano. The parlor was opulent, a stark contrast to the world outside, with velvet curtains and a mahogany bar stocked with whiskey her father had shipped from the east. She lifted her fingers from the keys. "Just the heat, Silas. It drains the spirit." "The heat is a constant." Like the threat beyond the valley, he said, his gaze drifting to the window towards the distant jagged line of the Dragoon Mountains Apache lands. "Your father and I were just discussing the need for a new patrol. They're getting bold. A stockman from Miller's Pass was found yesterday." "Arrows." He said the last word with a chilling finality. Josephine felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She'd heard the whispers, the tales of brutality from both sides, settlers encroaching treaties, broken retaliation, and then revenge. It was a vicious, bloody cycle, and she was to be married to the man who turned its terrible wheel. The next afternoon, desperate for a breath of air that wasn't thick with cigar smoke and grim pronouncements, Josephine rode out alone. Her horse, a spirited mare named Lyra, was her only true confidant. She urged her west away from the ranch and towards the broken country where the creeks ran thin and the saguaros stood like silent sentinels. This was her rebellion, small, secret, and vital. She was galloping through a shallow arroyo, lost in the rhythm of the ride, when the world tilted violently. A coiled rattlesnake, the color of the dry earth, struck at Lyra's foreleg. The mare screamed a sound of pure terror and reared with a force that snapped Josephine from the saddle. Time seemed to warp. She saw the hard-packed ground rushing up to meet her, the spiny cholla cactus waiting like a bed of nails. Her life didn't flash before her eyes. There was only a single paralyzing thought. This is how it ends. Then he was there. He moved not like a man walking, but like a piece of the landscape detaching itself from the background. One moment there was nothing but rock and shadow. The next, a figure of lean muscle and sun-darkened skin stood between her and the ground. He caught her with an impossible grace, his one hand clamped around her waist, solid and unyielding, while the other cupped the back of her head, saving her skull from the jagged rock she hadn't seen. The impact of his body against hers drove the air from her lungs. She was suspended for a heartbeat between a violent death and this stunning, absolute stillness. Her head was turned, her cheek pressed against the soft buckskin of his shirt. She could feel the heat of him, smell the scent of desert sage, and something else, something wild and clean. She lifted her eyes. They were the darkest she had ever seen, deep and intelligent, and in their depths she saw not the savagery Cain spoke of, but a startling calm. He was Apache. That much was clear from his high cheekbones, the striking line of his jaw and the single hawk feather tied in his long black hair. He wore no paint, only the stern, assessing expression of a man who understood the desert's deadly language. His fingers were still tangled in her hair, his other arm a band of steel around her. It was this single prolonged touch that undid her. It was not gentle or romantic. It was elemental. It was a touch of pure, unvarnished reality in her life of suffocating artifice. It spoke of strength without cruelty of presence, without possession. In that silent moment, a connection was forged, a spark jumping a chasm between two worlds that were supposed to be at war. He gently lowered her to her feet. His gaze flickered to the panicked mare, then back to her. He spoke no word. He didn't need to. His eyes asked if she was harmed. She could only shake her head, her throat too tight to form a sound. With a final lingering look that seemed to see past the fine dress and coiled hair to the frantic heart beneath, he turned. He retrieved her fallen hat, dusted it off with a deliberate motion, and held it out to her. As her fingers brushed his, the spark returned a jolt of shocking intensity. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he melted back into the rocks and shadows, leaving Josephine standing alone in the sudden deafening quiet of the arroyo, her world irrevocably and terrifyingly changed. Josephine returned to the B ranch in a daze, the encounter replaying in her mind with the vividness of a fever dream. She offered a flimsy excuse about a stumble omitting the snake the fall, and most importantly, the man who had caught her. But the truth of the moment had imprinted itself upon her, a secret brand she could feel beneath her skin. The memory of his touch was a constant distracting presence, an echo that made Sheriff Cain's subsequent attentions feel all the more repulsive. A week later, at a dinner celebrating the formal announcement of her engagement, Cain presented her with a necklace. It was a gaudy piece of silver and turquoise, purchased from a traveling merchant, heavy and cold against her collarbone. A man ought to adorn his finest possession, her father boomed, raising his whiskey glass. Cain smiled, a thin proprietary curving of his lips. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "Every man in this valley will know you belong to me, Josephine." His words, meant to be a promise of protection, felt like a sentence. Her mind fled the stifling parlor back to the arroyo. She thought of the Apache's hands, strong, capable, catching her, not as a possession, but as a life. He hadn't adorned her. He had saved her. A reckless compulsion took root. She had to see him again. It wasn't a thought, but a deep, primal need. The following days she rode out under the guise of exercising Lyra, her path always leading back to the same sun-scorched wash. She left small, foolish tokens, a blue ribbon from her hair, tied to a mesquite branch, a perfect quartz stone placed on the rock where he had steadied her. They were messages in a language she didn't know if he could read, cast into a wilderness that held no promises. For days, her offerings vanished, but he did not appear. She began to believe she had imagined him, that the desert heat had conjured a phantom. Then, on the fourth day, as she was about to turn back in despair, she saw him. He was perched atop a high rock formation, observing her, his form so still he was nearly invisible against the ochre stone. He wasn't hiding. He was simply being. There was a patience in him that felt geological, in scale. As her eyes met his, he descended the rock face with the fluid ease of a mountain lion. He stopped a respectful distance away, the silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind. "You are the rancher's daughter," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, calm and measured. His English was clear-accented but precise. "You speak my language," she breathed, surprised. A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, crossed his face. "To know your enemy, you must know his tongue. My name is Cale. I am Josephine Bellwether." "I know," he said simply. "It is not safe for you here. The daughter of Jedediah Bellwether." "Why did you help me?" she asked, the question that had tormented her nights. Kyle's dark eyes held hers. "I saw a life in danger. The snake does not care whose daughter you are." It was the purest, most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. In her world, every action was a calculation, a move to gain advantage, land or power. His motive was as clean and simple as the desert sky. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. I never had the chance to say it. From that day forward, the arroyo became their sanctuary. Their meetings were brief, stolen moments, freighted with the immense danger of their discovery. She learned that Kyle was Chiricahua, that his people had been driven from their ancestral lands in the high mountains, and now survived in the harsh wilderness, squeezed between the ever-expanding ranches and the Mexican border. He spoke of a world guided by seasons and spirits, a world where the earth was a mother, not a commodity to be carved up and sold. In turn, she told him of her life, of the books she read in secret, of her dreams of seeing the ocean, of the cold dread she felt when she thought of her future with Silas Kane. She found herself speaking with a candor she had never dared with anyone. Kyle listened with an unnerving stillness, his perception so keen it felt as though he could see the shape of her very soul. One sweltering afternoon, she found him tending to a small wound on his forearm, a long, clean slice. "What happened?" she asked, her heart lurching. "A disagreement with a cougar over a water source," he said, his tone matter of fact. He was trying to bind it with a strip of cloth, his movements awkward. Without thinking, Josephine dismounted and approached him. "Let me." She unfastened a clean handkerchief from her saddlebag. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took his arm. His skin was warm, the muscles beneath hard as stone. The touch was different this time, deliberate, tender. She carefully cleaned the cut with water from her canteen and wrapped it tightly. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but his arm remained perfectly still under her ministration. When she finished, she looked up and found his face inches from hers. The air grew thick, charged with an unspoken current that was far more powerful than their whispered words. His gaze dropped to her lips, and she saw the rigid control in his jaw, the battle being waged within him. She felt the same war in her own chest, a lifetime of conditioning warring with the undeniable truth of her heart. He leaned in slowly, and she closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. His lips brushed hers, hesitant at first, then with a deep, searching pressure that spoke of a loneliness as profound as her own. It was a kiss of stolen time, of impossible yearning. It tasted of the desert of danger and of a belonging she had never known. When they broke apart, the world had been remade. The line they had crossed was invisible, but its consequences would be devastatingly real. They didn't see the figure watching from the ridge above, a lone rider from the B-Bar-B, sent by a suspicious Sheriff Kane to follow her. The rider's name was Jebediah Jeb Coulter, a man whose loyalty to Kane was absolute. He spurred his horse back towards Redemption Creek, carrying the spark that would ignite a firestorm. The news that Jeb Coulter delivered struck the B-Bar-B ranch house like a bolt of lightning. He didn't speak to Jedediah Bellwether first. His loyalty and the delicious cruelty of the revelation belonged to Silas Kane. He found the sheriff on the porch of the jailhouse, oiling his Colt peacemaker. Jeb, a man whose face was a constant mask of greasy sweat and subservience, recounted the scene with breathless, lurid detail. Saw it with my own eyes, Sheriff. Kissing him. An Apache buck. Right out there in the crying woman wash, like she had no shame at all. The cylinder of the Colt clicked shut with a sound of metallic finality. Kane didn't move for a long moment. The only change was in his eyes. The washed-out blue seemed to freeze over, becoming chips of ice. The deep-seated hatred he held for the Apache had now found a singular personal focus. It was no longer a general malice. It was a white-hot spear of jealousy and betrayal aimed at one man. "Get Deputy Miller Kane," said his voice, terrifyingly calm. "Tell him to gather a posse, 10 men, good trackers. Tell them to be ready to ride in an hour. We're going hunting." "What's the charge?" Sheriff Jeb asked, eager for the violence to come. Kane looked up and, for the first time, a cruel smile touched his lips. "Abduction. The savage has taken my fiancée. We're going to get her back." The lie was perfect in its simplicity and its power. It transformed Josephine from a willing participant into a helpless victim, and Cale from a lover into a monster. It gave Kane the moral authority he needed to unleash the full force of his rage, not just on Cale, but on any of his people who got in the way. The posse rode first to the Bellwether Ranch. Kane strode into the opulent parlor without knocking, his spurs ringing on the polished wood floors. Jedediah was standing by the mahogany bar, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Silas, what's the meaning of this? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse, Jedediah." Kane snarled, throwing his gloves onto the table. "Your daughter has been taken by an Apache." The color drained from Jedediah's face. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. His daughter, his legacy, his beautiful civilized jewel, defiled by the very thing he'd spent his life trying to eradicate from the land. The shame was a physical blow followed immediately by a surge of possessive fury. "Taken, are you sure?" he choked out. "My man saw it. He dragged her out into the wilderness. God knows what he's doing to her right now." Kane lied, fanning the flames. "I have a posse. We ride immediately. We'll bring her back, and we'll hang the animal who took her from the highest cottonwood tree we can find." Jedediah, blinded by rage and humiliation, didn't question the narrative. It was easier to believe his daughter was a victim than to accept she had made a choice that so thoroughly repudiated him and his entire world. "Find her, Silas," he commanded, his voice trembling with rage. "Find her, and bring me the scalp of the man who did this." Meanwhile, Josephine returned home, blissfully unaware of the storm she had unleashed. The kiss had changed everything. The world felt sharper, more vibrant. Her future with Cain was no longer a dreadful certainty, but an impossible prison from which she now knew she had to escape. The only question was how. The answer arrived with the setting sun. As twilight bled across the sky, casting long shadows from the corrals, a small, smooth stone arched through her open bedroom window and landed softly on the rug. It was a signal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked out and saw him a fleeting shadow near the stables. Cale. Here. She slipped out of the house, her movements furtive and silent. She found him in the deep darkness behind the water trough. His face was grim, his usual calm replaced by a stark urgency. "You must not meet me in the arroyo again," he said, his voice low and intense. "You were seen." The bottom dropped out of Josephine's world. "Seen by who, a rider from your ranch?" He went straight to the man in the Silver Star. "They are coming. Not just for me. They will use this as an excuse. They will call it an abduction. They will ride against my people." The weight of his words crushed her. Her secret, her beautiful, dangerous secret, was about to become the justification for a massacre. "Silas. He'll kill you. He will try." Cale said, his jaw tight. "I came to warn you, and to give you a choice." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face, trying to gauge the strength he had only glimpsed. "They will come for you. They will say you are a victim. They will lock you away, marry you to him, and you will live in that house as a prisoner until your spirit dies. That is one path." He paused, letting the dreadful finality of that vision sink in. "The other is with me. Now, we ride tonight. We ride into the mountains where they will not easily follow. It will be a hard life. You will have nothing you have now. You will be hunted. You will be an outcast from your world forever. But you will be free. It was the ultimate choice. The gilded cage, safe and suffocating, or the terrifying absolute freedom of the wilderness at his side. There was no time for deliberation, no room for doubt. She looked from the imposing silhouette of her father's house, a monument to her imprisonment, to the face of the man who had shown her what it felt to be truly alive. The memory of his touch, the honesty in his eyes, the taste of his kiss. It was the only truth she had left. "My horse is in the stable." She whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "Give me 5 minutes." Kyle nodded, a flicker of profound relief in his eyes. He melted back into the shadows to wait. Josephine moved through the house like a ghost. She didn't take jewels or money. She took a sturdy pair of her brother's old riding boots, a leather canteen, a warm blanket, and a small leather-bound book of poetry she kept hidden under her mattress. They were tools for survival, and a token of the soul she was refusing to let die. As she led Lyra from the stable, the mare's hooves muffled by the soft dirt, she could hear the distant sound of the posse gathering in town, a faint murmur of angry voices and the jingle of harnesses. It was the sound of the war they were awakening. She met Kyle at the edge of the ranch property. He was waiting with his own paint horse, a tough, intelligent-looking animal. Without a word, he took Lyra's reins, leading them away from the open trail and into the labyrinth of canyons and ravines that marked the beginning of his world. As they rode, Josephine glanced back one last time. The lights of the B-Bar B were like embers in the vast darkness. It had been her entire world. Now it was the pyre of her old life. Ahead there was only darkness, the silhouette of Cale, and a terrifying, exhilarating unknown. She had made her choice. She was no longer Jedediah Bellwether's daughter or Silas Kane's fiancée. She was a fugitive, and she was free. The world beyond the B-Bar B ranch was a brutal and magnificent teacher. The first days of their flight were a blur of exhaustion and fear. Kyle pushed them relentlessly, choosing paths that defied logic, scaling sheer rock faces where horses seemed unable to go, threading through narrow slot canyons that scraped their legs raw, and traveling for hours under the oppressive glare of the moon to avoid the heat of day. Josephine's body, accustomed to corsets and side saddles, screamed in protest. Her muscles ached with a fire she had never imagined. Her skin, despite the wide-brimmed hat she'd stolen, burned and blistered. The soft hands that had known only piano keys and embroidery needles were now raw from gripping Lyra's reins. Yet with every painful mile, a part of her that had been dormant for a lifetime began to awaken. She learned to read the subtle language of the desert. Kale taught her how a certain type of greasewood bush indicated underground water, how to distinguish the track of a deer from that of a mountain lion, and how to listen to the silence for the telltale clatter of a dislodged stone that might signal a pursuit. He was a stern but patient mentor. He never offered praise easily, but when she found a patch of edible prickly pear fruit on her own, the small approving nod he gave her filled her with more pride than any compliment she had ever received in her father's house. Their conversations were sparse, born of necessity, and whispered in the brief moments they stopped to rest. But in their shared struggle, a new, deeper intimacy grew. It was in the way he would pass her the canteen, first even when his own lips were cracked from thirst. It was in the way she would take the first watch at night, allowing him a precious hour of sleep, her hand never far from the small knife he had given her. One night, huddled by a smokeless fire made of dry creosote in the belly of a hidden cave, she watched him sharpen an arrow point with a piece of flint. The focused intensity on his face, illuminated by the faint starlight from the cave mouth, was mesmerizing. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked softly. He didn't look up from his work. "My life is with my people. This running is not life. It is survival. But it is a life with purpose. We fight for our home. We fight for our future. Did you have a purpose in your father's house?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. Purpose. Her purpose had been to be ornamental, to be married off, to be a silent testament to her father's success. "No," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I had no purpose at all." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to hold the vast starry expanse of the desert sky. "Now you do," he said, "to live." Meanwhile, the hunt was on. Sheriff Silas Kane was not a man to be trifled with. He drove his posse with a fanatical zeal, his personal humiliation fueling a relentless pursuit. But Kale's knowledge of the land was a formidable defense. He led them into a maze of canyons, so confusing that two of the posse's horses broke their legs, forcing them to turn back. Kane, however, had an ace up his sleeve. He had sent a rider to Fort Huachuca to hire the one man in the territory who might be able to outthink an Apache, a disgraced army scout named Flint. Flint was a wiry man, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that missed nothing. He had lived with the Crow for a time and understood the way of the wild better than any white man Kane knew. He arrived at the posse's camp with no fanfare, riding a mule that looked as tough and enduring as he was. He studied the tracks Kale and Josephine had left. Where Kane saw a confusing jumble, Flint saw a story. "He's clever, this one," Flint said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "He's using the rock to hide his trail, doubling back on himself in the sandy washes. But he's got the woman with him. She's not used to this. Her horse will be tiring faster. She'll be leaving signs he can't erase." Flint pointed to a barely perceptible scuff mark on a rock. "Her mare, shod. The Apache's is not. He's heading for the Chiricahua Mountains, but he won't take the direct route. Too obvious. He'll try to circle through the Sulphur Springs Valley first, to find water, and throw you off. We don't follow him. We ride to the mouth of the valley and wait. Kane felt a surge of savage satisfaction. The net was closing. The trap was sprung 3 days later. Kyle and Josephine were leading their exhausted horses through a narrow pass that opened into the vast, grassy expanse of the valley. Kyle suddenly froze, holding up a hand. Josephine followed his gaze. Far in the distance, almost invisible against the morning haze, a plume of dust rose into the sky. A second plume appeared to the east. "They've cut us off," Cale said, his voice grim. "They predicted our path. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Josephine. They were trapped in the open. There was nowhere to hide." "What do we do?" she cried, her voice strained. Kyle's eyes scanned the terrain, his mind working with lightning speed. He pointed towards a jagged, formidable-looking peak that rose from the valley floor like a broken tooth. "We climb. The horses can't make it to the top, but men on foot will be slower. It's our only chance." They abandoned their horses, a heartbreaking necessity. Kyle slapped Lyra's flank, sending her galloping away as a decoy. They scrambled up the scree slope, their lungs burning rocks, sliding away beneath their feet. Below them they could hear the shouts of the posse as they discovered the abandoned horses. They climbed for hours, the sun beating down on them mercilessly. Josephine's fear was a physical thing, a clawing beast in her gut. But Kyle's calm was infectious. He moved ahead of her, finding handholds, guiding her feet, his presence a constant source of strength. They finally found refuge in a small, wind-swept cave just below the summit. From their vantage point, they could see the posse far below, small figures, spreading out to search the base of the mountain. They were trapped. The posse had them pinned down with no food and only the water left in their canteens. It was a matter of time. As night fell, they watched the pinpricks of the posse's campfires flicker to life below. Shivering in the cold mountain air, Josephine huddled next to Cale for warmth. The fear had subsided, replaced by a strange, fatalistic calm. "They will find us in the morning," she stated, her voice flat. "Yes," Kyle agreed. She turned to look at him, his profile carved by the moonlight. "I'm not sorry I came with you." He turned to face her, and in the pale light, she could see the deep emotion in his eyes. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her cheek. "Nor am I," he said. He leaned in and kissed her, not with the desperate passion of their first kiss, but with a deep, profound tenderness that spoke of acceptance and a shared fate. It was a kiss that acknowledged the end might be near, but in that acknowledgement they found a final defiant moment of peace. The war they had awakened was waiting for them at the bottom of the mountain, but for one night in their desolate sanctuary they had found a fragile kind of heaven. The dawn brought with it the chilling realization that waiting for the end was not in Kyle's nature. Before the first rays of sun crested the horizon, he was already moving. "They expect us to stay pinned," he whispered, his breath pluming in the cold air, "or to try and go down the way we came. We will do neither." He led her to the far side of the peak, a sheer cliff face that dropped hundreds of feet to a jagged mess of boulders. Josephine's stomach plummeted. "We can't go down there." "Not down," Kyle corrected, pointing sideways. "Across." He indicated a narrow, treacherous-looking ledge, barely a foot wide, in places that snaked its way around the face of the mountain. It was a terrifying prospect, a path for goats, not people. But looking down at the posse, beginning to stir, she knew it was their only hope. The crossing was the most harrowing experience of Josephine's life. With their backs pressed to the cold stone and their boots shuffling inches from a deadly drop, they moved with agonizing slowness. Kyle went first, his movements sure and steady, his low voice a constant murmur of encouragement. Do not look down. Trust the rock. Feel it with your hands. One step at a time. Josephine followed, her entire being focused on the few inches of stone before her. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She put her trust entirely in him, in his voice, and in the surprising strength she found in her own trembling limbs. Hours later, shaking and drenched in sweat, they reached the other side of the mountain. They had bypassed the posse completely. Their descent was difficult, but no longer impossible. By midday they were back on the valley floor, miles from their pursuers, their bodies bruised, but their spirits soaring with the thrill of their impossible escape. For 2 more days they traveled on foot, their pace slowed by hunger and exhaustion, until they finally reached the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains. Here, nestled in a hidden valley, was Kyle's village. It wasn't a large settlement, just a collection of wickiups domed huts made of branches and hides camouflaged so perfectly against the landscape that they were nearly invisible until you were upon them. The reception was not what Josephine had expected. There were no joyous greetings for Kyle's return. The faces that turned to them were gaunt and wary. An elder, a man with a face like a dried riverbed, met them. His name was Tarza. Kyle spoke to him in their native tongue, his voice low and urgent. Tarza's eyes flickered towards Josephine, his expression a mixture of suspicion and contempt. The entire village seemed to hold its breath. Women peered from the doorways of their homes, their faces hostile. Children who had been playing fell silent, hiding behind their mothers' skirts. She was the enemy, the physical embodiment of the people who were starving them, hunting them. One woman was particularly hostile. Her name, as Josephine would later learn, was Naylan. Her husband had been killed months earlier by soldiers from Fort Huachuca. Her gaze was filled with a venomous hatred. You bring a white woman here. She spat at Cale in broken English for Josephine's benefit. Is her touch worth the lives of our children when the soldiers follow? She is with me, Kyle stated, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced further argument, but it did not quell the resentment. Life in the village was a lesson in hardship. Food was scarce. The men hunted, but the game had been thinned by the encroaching ranchers. The women and children foraged for roots and berries. There was a quiet desperation that clung to the camp like the morning mist. Josephine tried to help, to make herself useful, but her efforts were clumsy and often met with scorn. She didn't know how to grind mesquite beans into flour or how to tan a deer hide. She was a liability. The only person who showed her any kindness was an old woman, the widow of a great warrior named Chaitan. She was nearly blind, but her hands were nimble and her mind was sharp. She saw past Josephine's white skin to the spirit within. She set Josephine to mending clothes and moccasins, a task her needle skills were suited for. It was through these quiet hours sitting by Chaitan's widow and listening to her stories of the old ways that Josephine began to find a fragile place for herself. She also discovered a new side to Kyle. Here among his people, he was not just a warrior and a tracker. He was a leader. He settled disputes, he organized hunting parties, and he gave his own small share of food to families with young children. The weight of his responsibility was immense, and she saw the toll it took on him in the weary lines around his eyes. Their love, born in the wild freedom of their flight, now had to survive in a place of confinement and despair. But a more insidious danger was breeding within the camp itself. A warrior named Nasha had watched Kyle's return with Josephine with a cold, calculating eye. Nasha had seen too much death, too much starvation. He believed the fight was lost. He argued in council that their only hope was to surrender to the reservation, to accept the white man's peace, no matter how humiliating. Kyle argued passionately against him, speaking of freedom and fighting for their ancestral home. Most of the warriors sided with Kyle, their pride and hatred for the soldiers still strong. Nasha saw this as foolish pride, leading them to annihilation. He saw Josephine's presence as a catalyst for the final, bloody end. He believed that Sheriff Kane wanted only two people, the Apache who had stolen his bride and the bride herself. He made a terrible secret calculation. If he were to deliver Kale and the white woman, perhaps the rest of his people would be spared. Perhaps they would be offered a treaty food, a chance to survive. It was a traitor's logic, born of utter despair. One night, under the sliver of a new moon, Nasha slipped away from the village. He rode hard for 2 days back, towards the lands they had fled. He knew the posse would still be searching, frustrated and angry. He left a sign, a series of deliberately placed broken branches, a trail that a scout as skilled as Flint could not fail to understand. It was a signal that pointed directly towards the hidden valley. The betrayal was complete. As Nasha rode back to the village, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, Flint, scouting ahead of the posse, found the first of the broken branches. "He's made a mistake," another man in the posse said. Flint dismounted and examined the break. It was too clean, too deliberate. He looked ahead and saw another 100 yards on. "That's no mistake," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "That's an invitation." The attack came not at dawn, but in the dead, silent hour just before it. Guided by Nasha's trail, Kane, Flint, and the posse had crept into the mountains surrounding the valley with chilling efficiency. They didn't open with a full-throated charge. Kane was more cunning than that. The first shot was a statement. A lone Apache hunter, leaving the village early to check his traps, was struck from his horse by a rifle bullet from the ridge above. The single sharp crack echoed through the canyon like the breaking of a bone. The village erupted into a chaos of screams and desperate action. Warriors grabbed their rifles and bows, while women herded terrified children into the relative safety of the wickiups. Kyle emerged from his dwelling, his face a mask of grim understanding. He knew instantly this was no random patrol. They had been found. They were besieged. To the rocks he commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. "Use the canyon walls for cover." The handful of Apache warriors, outnumbered 3-1 and outgunned, scrambled for defensive positions among the boulders at the base of the canyon. The air was soon filled with the crackle of rifle fire and the whistle of arrows. Bullets kicked up dust and splintered the rocks, pinning them down. Josephine, her heart pounding with a terror that was both for herself and for the people around her, found herself huddled with Chaitan's widow and a group of children behind a thick stone outcrop. The old woman was calm, her blind eyes turned towards the sounds of the battle, as if she could see the events unfolding. "The hawk has found the nest," she said, her voice a low rasp. Josephine saw Nalin, the woman who despised her, get struck in the arm by a ricocheting bullet as she tried to pull her son to safety. Without a second thought, Josephine tore a strip from her own petticoat and scrambled to her side, pressing the makeshift bandage against the wound. Nalin stared at her, her eyes wide with shock and pain, the hatred momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected act of courage. The battle raged for hours. The posse, with their superior rifles and positions, inflicted casualties, but could not break the Apache defense. Kyle moved among his warriors like a phantom, his own rifle barking defiance, his presence a source of courage for his men. But he knew it was a battle of attrition they could not win. Their ammunition was limited. their numbers dwindling. From his perch, Silas Kane watched the battle with a cold, predatory patience. He wasn't just here to wipe out the village. He wanted Kyle and Josephine. He wanted his prize. Flint, he ordered, "Take 3 men. Circle around to the west. There's a game trail there. Get behind them. We'll crush them between us." As Flint and his men slipped away, Nasha watched from his position among the warriors, the full weight of his betrayal crashing down on him. He had expected Kane to offer terms to demand the surrender of Kale. He had not expected this indiscriminate slaughter. He saw the terror on the faces of the children. He saw Narlin's blood staining the earth, and he realized the catastrophic nature of his miscalculation. Kane would not spare anyone. He had simply used Nasha's despair to lead him to the slaughterhouse. The sheriff didn't want peace. He wanted extermination. A profound, soul-shattering guilt seized him. He looked at Kale fighting fiercely, not for pride, but for the lives of the women and children huddled behind him. Nasha knew he could not undo what he had done, but perhaps he could alter its final, bloody chapter. He saw Flint's men disappearing into the brush to the west. He knew the trail they were taking. It led to a high, unstable cliff overlooking the canyon's only viable escape route, a narrow, dry riverbed. An idea desperate and final formed in his mind. He crawled over to Kale. "They are flanking us from the west," he yelled over the gunfire. "You must take the women and children and flee through the lower wash. I will hold the pass with 2 others to give you time." Kyle looked at him, suspicion warring with the desperate need for a solution. But there was a new, strange light in Nasha's eyes, not of ambition, but of atonement. "Go," Nasha urged. For the people, Kyle made the decision. He gave the order to retreat. A fighting withdrawal began, the warriors falling back to cover the frantic scramble of the non-combatants towards the riverbed. Josephine helped Narlin and her son, practically carrying the boy as they ran. As they fled, Nasha and 2 loyal warriors did not retreat. Instead, they charged upwards towards the high cliffs, directly into the path of Flint's flanking party. It was a suicide run, a desperate diversion. Kane and his men, seeing the charge, concentrated their fire on the 3 warriors, believing it to be a last foolish attempt at a counterattack. The diversion gave Kyle and the others the precious minutes they needed. They reached the narrow wash, a deep scar in the earth that would shield them from the posse's fire. High above, Nasha reached the unstable cliff edge just as Flint's men closed in. He was shot twice in the leg and the shoulder, but he did not stop. He ignored the men and focused on a series of large, precariously balanced boulders at the cliff's edge. With the last of his strength, he and his 2 dying companions heaved against the largest rock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the rock tilted. It triggered a cascade, a thundering avalanche of stone and earth that poured down the mountainside, completely blocking the pass Flint had been aiming for, and more importantly, sealing the entrance to the wash through which Kale and the survivors were escaping. Flint and his men dove for cover as the world dissolved into a roar of falling rock. When the dust settled, the path was gone, buried under tons of rubble. Nasha and his companions were gone with it. Down below, Kane let out a roar of pure fury. His prey had escaped. The siege was broken, the path of pursuit obliterated. The cost had been high for the Apache, but they had survived. Days later, deep in the safety of the Dragoon Mountains, the small band of survivors made a new temporary camp. Their numbers were halved, their spirits broken, but they were alive. Josephine, no longer an outcast, but a fellow survivor who had earned her place through bravery, tended to the wounded alongside Chaitan's widow. That evening, Kyle stood with her on a precipice, looking out over the vast, unforgiving land that was now their only home. The war was not over. Silas Kane was still out there, his hatred now honed to a razor's edge. Her father's power was still a shadow that stretched across the territory. They had not found peace. But as Kyle took her hand, his touch was no longer just a spark of connection. It was a promise. It spoke of shared loss of a future that would be a constant struggle, but one they would face together. They had lost almost everything, but in the heart of the firestorm they had awakened, they still had each other. And for now that was enough. The story of Josephine and Kyle doesn't end here in the quiet of the mountains. Their flight for survival has only just begun. Sheriff Silas Kane's vengeance is a fire that will not be easily quenched, and the clash of their two worlds has left scars on the land that will never truly fade. Their love story became a legend, a whispered tale of defiance in an era of brutality, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of wildernesses, the human heart is the most untamable territory of all. They chose love, and in doing so, chose a life of constant battle, forever fleeing the war they awakened. What do you think happened to them? Did they ever find a place of peace, or was their life a constant flight from the ghosts of Redemption Creek? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of love betrayal and survival in the Old West captured your imagination, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a classic Western drama. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next tale from the forgotten pages of history. Thanks for listening.